They told her she was worthless, not behind her back, right to her face. Her own mother compared her to a ghost, useless and gone. Teachers dismissed her, neighbors whispered about her failures, and friends slowly disappeared. Every time she tried to rise, the world reminded her that she wasn't enough. These words carved deep wounds, the kind that don't bleed on the outside but break you on the inside. For years, she carried them like chains, believing she was destined to remain unseen. But something remarkable happened in that silence of rejection. Instead of letting the insults destroy her, she began to harden. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in resilience. Each cruel word became another brick in the wall of strength she was building around her heart. Her skin thickened, her spirit sharpened, and she started to understand that pain, when endured long enough, can become protection. She wasn't fragile anymore. She was transforming, piece by piece, into something unbreakable. Life gave her little, second-hand clothes, empty nights, and loneliness so heavy it could drown the strongest soul. Yet in those conditions, she learned survival. She learned how to live with nothing and still wake up the next day willing to fight. It wasn't the kind of fight you saw in boxing rings or in front of crowds. It was the quiet, invisible fight of refusing to collapse when everyone expected you to. And in that hidden fight, she began to taste the first drops of her own strength. Still, she didn't rise overnight. Her journey was slow, painful, and filled with doubt. Some nights she still wondered if the world was right about her, if she really was nothing more than the failure they all saw. But then she looked at her scars, at the fact that she was still standing after everything, and she realized something powerful. Broken people don't keep standing. Broken people don't keep moving. The fact that she was still here meant she was never truly broken at all. She was stronger than the story they tried to trap her in, and so the girl who was called worthless became something greater. Not by applause, not by validation, but by surviving what should have destroyed her. Her unbreakable spirit wasn't a gift. It was built in fire, in hunger, in loneliness, in rejection. And that is why, when the world finally looked at her again, they didn't see a fragile shadow. They saw steel. They saw a fighter. They saw someone who had walked through every reason to quit and had chosen, again and again, to keep going. From worthless, she had become unbreakable. The camp was merciless. Every morning began with the sting of cold air in her lungs and the weight of doubt pressing against her chest. Her body ached from drills she could barely finish, and her foot screamed with every step, but she said nothing. Others laughed, whispered, and waited for her to break. Failure seemed to follow her everywhere. On the track, in the mud, during the endless push, ups that made her arms tremble like thin branches in the wind. Pain wasn't just a part of her days. It became her constant companion. At first, she hated it. Every burning muscle felt like proof that she wasn't enough, every stumble like confirmation that she didn't belong. But slowly, she began to notice something. Pain was not ending her. It was shaping her. Every time she collapsed and forced herself back up, she learned something new about herself. The ache in her bones was teaching her endurance. The bruises on her skin were teaching her persistence. What had once felt like punishment was quietly becoming her teacher. There were moments when the pain nearly won, when her lungs clawed for air and her legs refused to move. Yet in those very moments, when most would stop, she discovered a strange truth. Pain was not the enemy. Pain was the proof that she was still fighting. It meant she hadn't quit, hadn't surrendered. The sting in her body told her she was still in the arena, still alive, still willing to carry on when others gave up. And that realization turned every moment of suffering into something meaningful. Her perspective shifted. She no longer tied her worth to winning or to being the strongest in the field. Instead, she tied it to showing up every day, no matter how much it hurt. She laced her boots tighter with swollen hands, pushed through swollen feet, and stood in formation even when her body begged her to sit. Pain was no longer an obstacle. It was the price of transformation, and she was willing to pay it every single day. In the end, her strength wasn't measured by medals or times on a stopwatch. It was measured in scars, in fractures, in nights when she ran alone in the freezing dark. Pain had been the language of her journey, and she had learned to speak it fluently. What once threatened to destroy her had given her purpose. She wasn't running from pain anymore. She was running with it, letting it sharpen her, letting it carve her into someone the world could no longer ignore. Pain, she had learned, was not suffering. It was the birthplace of power. She was never the loudest voice in the room. She didn't command attention with speeches or confidence. In fact, most of the time, people barely noticed her until the moment they needed her. While others boasted about strength or mocked the weak, she stayed quiet. She listened, she observed, and when the time came to act, she acted without hesitation. That silence, once mistaken for weakness, began to reveal itself as something else entirely: strength in its purest, most unshakable form. The turning point came not when she outran anyone or lifted more than the others, but when she carried a teammate down the mountain. No one had ordered her to. No one had expected her to. The others had left him behind, chasing their own finish line. But she stayed. She chose the harder road, the road of service. Her shoulders bent under his weight. Her lungs burned with every step, yet she refused to let him fall. That was the moment the whispers began to change. Not of doubt this time, but of respect. Leadership was never about being the loudest or the strongest. It was about being the one who stayed when it mattered. She was the first to arrive, the last to leave. The one who carried extra gear without complaint. She wasn't competing to stand out. She was working so no one else would be left behind. Slowly, others began to follow her example, not because she demanded it, but because she inspired it. Her leadership was not written in rules or ranks. It was written in actions. Even in moments of chaos, her voice carried a strange calm. When another recruit froze with fear during a drill, she didn't bark orders or shame her. Instead, she leaned close, steady eyes meeting trembling ones, and whispered, "You're safe. Breathe. I've got you." That simple act of reassurance did what no shouting could have done. It broke through fear and brought someone back to strength. In that moment, it became clear. People didn't follow her because they had to. They followed her because they trusted her. By the end, even the instructors who once doubted her began to see the truth. Leadership wasn't about being noticed. It was about noticing others. It wasn't about standing in the spotlight. It was about standing firm when no one was watching. She had become the kind of leader the world rarely sees, but desperately needs: the leader who rises not through noise or arrogance, but through quiet, unshakable resolve. Her silence had never been emptiness. It had been power all along. For most of her life, she walked through the world unseen. People looked at her, but they didn't really see her. They saw failure, a dropout, a girl from nowhere with nothing to offer. Every time she tried to step forward, the world seemed to look right through her, as if she was made of smoke. That invisibility was its own kind of prison, silent, suffocating, convincing her that she would never matter. But all of that changed the day her name was called over the loudspeaker. She thought it was the end. She limped to the command office, believing they were finally sending her home, that all her effort had been for nothing. Her heart raced, not with hope, but with fear that her worst nightmare, being dismissed, forgotten again, was about to come true. But instead of rejection, she walked into the unimaginable. A man in a dark suit, a phone waiting, and a voice on the line that carried the weight of the nation. The President of the United States had read her words. He was calling for her. The moment was surreal. She could barely breathe as his voice filled the room, steady and warm, telling her that she was not worthless, that her endurance, her leadership, her refusal to break, these were not small things. They were the very definition of strength. For the first time, someone with power didn't just see her struggle. He recognized it. He named it. He honored it. The world had always told her she was nothing. Now, the highest office in the land was telling her she was something extraordinary. It wasn't just a phone call. It was a lightning bolt. A lifetime of silence shattered in a single moment. Every insult, every dismissal, every night she had written letters in the dark. They all led to this. In those few minutes, the invisible girl became visible. She was no longer the ghost walking through forgotten streets. She was no longer the failure no one believed in. She was Kayla Monroe, and the world finally saw her. As the news spread across the camp and beyond, she stood stunned in the middle of it all. The same recruits who once laughed now reached for her hand. The same instructors who doubted her now stood with pride. For the first time, she wasn't surviving in the shadows, she was standing in the light. And in that light, she realized something profound. Being seen was not about applause or recognition. It was about finally knowing, deep in her bones, that she had always been worthy. She just needed the world to catch up. Her story could have ended with the president's call. It could have been enough to be recognized, to be lifted out of the shadows into a place of honor. But for her, that moment was not the finish line. It was the beginning, because she knew there were countless others still trapped in the same silence she once lived in. Young boys and girls being told they were nothing, teenagers giving up on dreams before they even had a chance to chase them. She couldn't walk away from them. She had to go back. So she returned to the very town that had dismissed her, not as the invisible girl above a pawn shop, but as a leader carrying something new hope. She opened the Monroe Youth Center, a place she wished she had when the world abandoned her. There were books, computers, therapy sessions, and a message written on the wall in bold letters. To the kids no one believed in. It wasn't just a building. It was a lifeline for the unseen. A place where worth was not questioned, but discovered. She became what she once needed. When broken children walked through the doors, she greeted them with the words she once longed to hear. You belong here. You are not broken. You are just beginning. She spoke in schools and gyms, her voice raw and honest, telling kids that being called worthless was not the end of their story. She didn't offer empty inspiration. She offered proof. Her life is evidence that survival could become transformation, that pain could become power. And slowly, the unseen began to rise. Teenagers who had once felt invisible picked up notebooks and started writing, just as she once did. Others found courage to face their struggles, because they saw her scars and realized they weren't alone. She wasn't just telling them they mattered. She was showing them. Her presence was living testimony that the overlooked and underestimated could become the leaders and healers of tomorrow. In the end, she was no longer just the girl who answered the president's call. She had become something greater. The voice of all those still unheard. Her journey was proof that when one person rises, they don't rise alone, they lift countless others with them. She had carried the weight of being unseen for so long, and now she carried something far more powerful, the responsibility of helping others to be seen. And in that, she found her true purpose. Not just surviving, not just being recognized, but becoming the light for those still walking in the dark.